Thank you. Thank you, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Michelle. Thank you. Well, when I was listening to Michelle, I was thinking about a presentation I attended once from Richard Boyatis. He's the guy that did all the initial work on emotional intelligence that Daniel Goleman gets most of the credit for. But Richard, it was this real distinguished presentation at the Society for Psychologists in Management. And Richard started off by playing Gladys Knight and the Pips and danced through the room. And I thought, man, this is a MIT, Harvard professor, this distinguished person. And then at the end, he said, now I've got your brains just about where I want them so that you'll be receptive to what I'm saying. And until today, I thought Richard really held first place at being able to get people where you wanted them to be. But I think Michelle took the cake today. And so she's now first place and Richard's second. So let's see if I can work this thing. But today what I really want to talk to you about is you. And I want to take you on a journey that along the way might seem a little bit complicated. But when we're at the end of the journey, I'm going to kind of simplify some of the things that we talk about. Let me tell you how I got interested in working with CEOs, because my traditional training started pretty early. My first introduction into leadership was when I was 25. I just finished my PhD, which I never thought I'd get out of high school, much less get a PhD in psychology, but people's lives change. And so my first job was at the University of South Florida, and my first job was as director of the counseling center at USF. And there were 48 psychologists and psychiatrists on the staff. The next youngest person was 42. So you can imagine how much resentment and how much I had to deal with. And so I kind of got interested in leadership from that perspective. But while I was at the university, as I was in several different leadership positions, and my most recent one was as an associate vice president, where I had responsibility for 500 employees. And one of the things I saw the university do over and over again is they would hire top-notch consultants. They would pay them $300,000, $400,000. They'd come in 2 days, they'd write a report, and they would disrupt the organization, but they would leave the president's cabinet alone. And I realized that the consultants are actually making the organization worse, and that the person you really need to work with is the person at the top. You need to work with the leaders. You need to work with the people that are calling the shots. Because like a parent, years ago, they used to have a concept in child therapy called play therapy. And they'd bring the children in and they'd work with them and then they'd send them back home to the same home that they were in before they worked with them. And they'd regress right back to where they were before. So eventually psychologists learned, you got to work with the parents. Well, I've learned you got to work with the leaders. You have to work with the people at the top. Now today what I want to do is I want to take you on a journey, first on the outside, to tell you a little bit about the world of work, what motivates people, what the current reality is out there as we look at the workforce in the US, irrespective of the profession. And then I want to take you on a journey inside, so that you can learn about yourselves as individuals and as leaders, and you can maybe identify some of the ways in which you get in your own way, some of the ways in which you keep your team from achieving the very things you want them to achieve. And if everything seems a little unclear at the end, I have a few books I could recommend and some things that you might do to take you further. So let's start with this slide. Here's a few disturbing research findings. 1, 93% of, this is nationwide, of the people in the United States feel that their boss has never even recognized them for any kind of significant achievement. And also you'll notice the bottom quote by Dr. Stanley McChrystal, General Stanley McChrystal, only 20% of workers feel empowered to act resourcefully. This is every profession, every job, every team. This is some research from McGill University. 70% of workers would be willing to take a 10% reduction in pay if they could get their boss fired. Now here's the big study. Everyone's heard of the Gallup Corporation, the pollsters, and one of the big pollsters in the country. They did research on 100 million people in the United States who hold full-time jobs. And what they found is that 70% of them were disengaged. Only 30% were actually engaged. And of the 70%, 50% were disengaged, basically slackers, but 20% were actively disengaged. What does actively disengaged mean? It means if you could undermine your company, if you could hurt your company, if you could sabotage the deal, you'd actually do it. That's pretty dangerous. And of the 30% who were engaged, they were responsible for 240% of the performance-related outcomes of the business. Now I'm going to just touch on organizational structures only because when I was at the university, I was part of a management team, and probably over a period of 5 years, we read 150 books on leaderships, organizations, and out of all those books and all that, I hate to read, by the way, but I did it. Out of all those books and all that information, there were only a couple of books that really stood out to me as vital and really, really important. And one of them was on organizations. And the book was called The Fifth Discipline. And the fifth discipline identified 5 things every organization needs to do to be successful. I'm just going to list and briefly talk about those 5 things because the book is really a bear to get through. Nobody likes reading it, but I want to at least give you a little flavor of what's important in it. Then I want to focus on leadership, which is really focusing on you. And the third arm of a successful organization is the workforce. Well, I've already said I think the workforce is a function of the leadership. And you can see the kind of leadership we have in the country when you see the data that I just referred you to. All right, so let's take a quick look at leadership. Leadership is the act of making a difference and of achieving priority results through people. Now, a learning organization, which is the book I said that really stood out to me, is an organization that continually evolves its capacity to create its own future. Now imagine if you, as an individual, because you are an organization, you're an organization of history, organs, relationships. Imagine if you as an organization could continually evolve your capacity to create your own future. That means pretty much, as Michelle said, if you believed in yourself strongly enough, you could create the desired future that you wanted. This is how an organization can do that. You just need to master 5 things. Now think of your team, think of organizations you've known, and I'm just going to talk briefly about these, but if you miss any of these, you're not going to have an organization that can continually evolve its capacity to create its own future. The first discipline is shared vision. Now basically what a shared vision is rather than the leader saying, this is my vision for the company, if all of us in this room were starting an organization or a corporation, I'd want everyone here to tell me where they wanted to be personally in their own life and in their own company in the next 5 years or 7 years. And then out of everybody's story, we would try to distill it down to a vision. Something where everyone in this room that's going to be part of the organization going forward can see themselves, their dreams, their desires embedded in the vision of the organization. So a shared vision is something that bubbles up from the top. You talk to the workers first and you say, what can you believe in? What can you devote your time and energy in? What would make you excited to come to work? What vision aligns with where you want to see yourself in 5 or 7 years? The second discipline is personal mastery. Personal mastery, and again, Michelle touched on this very beautifully, is you have to commit to yourself as a project, not just your team, not just your organization, but yourself. because there's a direct relationship between what you achieve for yourself, how much access you have to your ability and your potential, and the success of your organization. Most human beings only operate on 0.1% of their capability. And as we talk a little bit, you're going to see what limits you from having access to your capability. Everyone in this room has had the sense sometime in their life that they're more capable than they can access. They can get little glimpses and little sort of like peeks into what they could really achieve, but something keeps them from doing it on a consistent basis. It's almost as if they're using the wrong fuel to get into the stratosphere, but they can see the stratosphere and they can see hopes and dreams for themselves just kind of eluding or slipping away. The next discipline is mental models. When you saw the picture of the iceberg with the conscious and the unconscious that Michelle showed, mental models are at the deepest level of the unconscious. And we'll show another picture, not as good as the one Michelle showed, of a similar iceberg that talks about habits and disciplines. But unless you get in touch with the parts you don't know about yourself, you're never going to have access to your full potential. There's a book that just came out. It's a bestseller, and there's an audio book, and it's one I've recommended to several people. It's called The 10 Rules for Life, and it's by a psychologist from McGill University. And he was, I saw him interviewed on Tucker Carlson one night, and they showed a clip of him with a CNN reporter, and the reporter was really trying to stump him. And eventually, just the way he answered the questions, the reporter ended up getting stumped. And he said to the reporter, "I stumped you, didn't I?" And she said, "Yeah." And so after he talked for several minutes on the air, they were almost out of time, and Tucker Carlson asked him a question. He said, "If you could just summarize your whole book and all of the things," he said, "you're one of the smartest people I've ever talked to. And if you could just put everything in one sentence, what would it be?" And his one sentence was, "What you don't know about yourself is much more important than what you know about yourself in deciding your life, your future, your power, your ability to persuade, your ability to connect, and your ability to influence." The next one is team learning. Team learning is kind of like the idea that if you put a team together and the team is operating at the level of honesty and dialogue, where everyone can say fully there are no non-discussables, people can talk about everything that's important to them. If you communicate at that level, then a presence gets created that is greater than the presence of the entire team individually. So the sum totals of the IQs of the team, the presence that gets created in team learning is greater than that. So something unique occurs that makes the team more powerful than the sum total of the individuals on the team. And that's called team learning. And then the last one is systems thinking. Systems thinking is really important, and it reminds me of, like, on my first job, I had this one employee that was she was really a pain. And I was just dying for her to retire. She was about 60 years old at the time, and if I said black, she said white, and I had 48 people to deal with at the time. And so I went to my boss, who was a vice president, and I said, "How could we get rid of her? Could you move her somewhere else, because everyone else is doing fine." And he gave me one of the most important lessons of my leadership life. The most important employees are those that tell you what you don't want to hear. And if you get rid of her tomorrow, your remaining people, someone's going to emerge in that role, because you're creating the need for that form of expression. And you need to first look at yourself, not getting rid of the things you don't like, but understanding why they're there and what message they're communicating to you. Okay, so that's just a brief overview of the most important business book ever written. And I hope that I gave you the essence of it, so it's up to you to decide what you want to do with it. All right, so the leadership question that's most important is, which of your dreams are so big that only your heart and not your head can hold them? Star performers always operate at this level. Now, do you know why that is? You're going to discover, I'm going to talk a little bit about the brain in a very simplified way, but the most recent area of your brain to develop is the part right behind your forehead, which is called the frontal lobes. And you know, you've heard of the reptile brain, which is kind of in the middle of the brain, and it causes us to get angry quickly and to fly into a rage and to do erratic things. But the most recent area of your brain tends to have a calming influence. It's more of it has the controls that you need to think things through and to anticipate consequences. Well, when your dreams are so big that the North Star is what you're pursuing, and you really want to create something greater than you ever dreamed that you could create, then your brain is exactly in the right place to do all the little things, all the tactical and operational things that you need to do to achieve your dreams. So the most effective leaders pay attention, the most effective leaders pay attention to events, but patterns of behavior and systematic structures are more important. So this employee that I wanted to get rid of, that was an event, that was an irritant in my life. But what was really important was understanding at the systemic level how I was creating that. So in the book Team of Teams, these are two, one of the things I've done recently is I've worked with Special Forces and Navy SEALs, and I've given a lot of talks at the base, and actually have a Navy SEAL commander who's on my team at CEO Effectiveness, and he's written a book called The Path, which I'll talk about a little later. But one of the Navy SEAL commanders that I've always had a lot of respect for is General Stanley McChrystal. And I wanted to show you this one slide, particularly the second part, which says 20th century leadership places self-knowledge at the center of agility and adaptability. And you'll see that the most important thing a leader could do or an individual can do is to be agile and adaptive. Now, there's a great book by Fred Keel called Return on Character. And what I really like about this book, it's the first book ever that I've ever read in this country that links return on investment to your character as a leader. And he talks about character. Basically what character is character is how you treat somebody that can't repay you in any way. Okay? Character has 4 components, and all 4 have to be present for a person of outstanding character. The first component is responsibility. You have to take responsibility for the consequences of your action and for the performance of your team. The second is integrity. You have to be honest, even if it hurts, because it gets too complicated if you're not. But then these are the 2 characteristics of character that come from the head, but they're 2 from the heart. And the 2 from the heart are forgiveness and compassion. When you have those 4 things together, then you are a person of high character. Now here's the good part. Keel he's worked with hundreds of CEOs, Fortune 500 companies, Fortune 100 companies. He divided them on the basis of psychological testing into 2 groups, high character, average character. The group with the high character had a 5 times greater return on investment than the group of low character, even though they were all intelligent, they all had tremendous knowledge, skills, and abilities. They were all experienced leaders and chief executive officers of major corporations. He also talked just briefly about, and I like this, there are 3 habits that relate to character. The empathy habit, being able to see things from the perspective of the other. The other's first habit, I like that one. If you could first seek to understand and then be understood, you're much more apt to make good decisions. And the I screwed up habit, you simply admit when you made a mistake, and as Michelle said earlier, you view your mistakes as an opportunity to get better. In fact, we learn more from mistakes than we do from successes. The number 1 practical competency for leaders is empathy. and there's a zero correlation between IQ and empathy. Now I want to read you this. Does anyone know who these people are?
Father and son?
They are, you're right. Hey, I like that. They're father and son. But John Huntsman, yes, John Huntsman Jr. was a senator from Utah. He's just, maybe a month ago, he was just named ambassador to Russia. And his daughter is a television, like a news commentator on one of the major networks. But what I really want to read you this story about is John Huntsman Sr. And I'm just going to read you like a short paragraph, but I think this is one of the most amazing stories. Okay, John Huntsman, this is back in 1990. The elder Huntsman was negotiating an acquisition with Charles Miller Smith, who is the president and CEO of a chemical company. During the negotiations, Smith's wife died. Huntsman emphasized with Smith, so he decided not to push any further. I decided the fine points of the last 20% could have clawed another $200 million out of the deal, but it would have come at the expense of Charles's emotional state. The agreement, as it stood, was good enough. So he decided to take $200 million less because he had left the last 20% of the deal undone because Smith's wife had died. And then it says, was the CEO's emotional state really worth $200 million to Huntsman? Believe it or not, this wasn't the first time Huntsman gave away a fortune during a negotiation. Just 4 years earlier in 1986, he made a verbal agreement with the CEO named Emerson Kempton. Huntsman would sell 40% of a division of a company to Kempton for $54 million. Due to legal delays, the contract wasn't written until 6 months later. By that time, Huntsman's profits had skyrocketed. That 40% of the division was now worth $250 million. Kempton called with a matcher's offer. He said he would split the difference, and he proposed to pay $152 million instead of the original $54 million. Huntsman was poised to bring in nearly triple the original agreement, but he said no. The $54 million was good enough. Kempton was incredulous. That's not fair to you. Huntsman replied, I'll decide what's fair to me. All right, so that's the best example I can think of integrity. By the way, Huntsman Sr. is a billionaire. Wonder why? I mean, would you hesitate to make a deal with him? This is the beginning of the journey inside. Give me a couple of thoughts of what you see in this picture. Yes, sir.
The elephant's tied down. He can't do anything because he's tied up.
Okay. He can't. I like that. He can't do anything because he's.
It's a small stake, a small.
Okay, right. Right. This is what Deepak Chopra calls predetermined cognitive schema. And this elephant is a picture of everyone in this room, including me. Because what happens is when you're a small baby elephant and you tie a thin little string and tie it to a stake, I mean, elephants can knock down trees, right? Tie it to a stake, the elephant learns that he can't defeat the stake and he stays tethered to the stake. And so then when he grows up big, you can use that same rope and that same little stick and the elephant will stay in place. That's the reason, that's fundamentally the reason why all of us in this room, including me, never access their true potential. Because we are tethered by our predetermined learning. We are tethered by what we learned about ourselves that wasn't true. And I'm going to talk a little bit about how that happens and then suggest to you some ways that you might get out of it. So what happens is you're born into a family. If we're lucky, our parents are neurotic, just neurotic, okay? And so They are teaching, the first thing and I'm going to give you some real illustrations that are going to undermine this. They're teaching us, they are our world. We don't know anything else. You'll see in later slides, when an infant is born, there are no connections in their brain. It's pretty much blank. And so these parents, with their own insecurities, their own pain, their own conflicts, are teaching this child about themselves. They're teaching the child how lovable you are, how smart you are, what you're capable of, whether being a male or female makes a difference in what you can achieve. All those things are being taught. And we're taking those in as ideas. The problem is that over time, those ideas become beliefs. And even worse, those beliefs become mental models. And those mental models are what reside at the deepest level of the unconscious, at the base of that iceberg where the unconscious is. And everyone in this room is more significantly influenced by those mental models than anything you think about yourself. And we all think that we know ourselves. We all think we know what to stay away from, what not to stay away from. But another thing happens. Once we develop that early mental model, we develop friendships. We hang around the people that validate our mental model about ourselves. And so we're constantly, almost like lacquer, like when you shellac something, you give it 100 coats. Every time we interact with one of those friends, we're lacquering the part of our brain that tells us the wrong thing about ourselves. And so eventually we believe that's it. There's no place else to go. This is who we are. And we warp our whole life. And then what makes it worse is we pick our significant other that validates that early belief. Okay? And just as an aside, by the way, the function of marriage or of lifelong relationships is to repair the damage of the past. It is not a love affair. It is an opportunity to unravel that mental model if you stick it out. If you bolt and start it over again, then you just recalibrate the whole thing, and 85% of second marriages end in divorce. Okay? So if you didn't learn anything, you might as well stay with the pain and the combat that's going on in the first one and see if you can understand something more about yourself. Okay, there are two basic paths to effectiveness in work and in life. One is extending the current version of yourself, that is what you believe is yourself. And I use an example that, people think that knowledge, skills, and abilities, and training, and degrees, and all that crap is what makes you effective, is what makes you knowledgeable, is what makes you able to change your life and expand yourself. It's not. There are plenty of people that know nothing about themselves that are in enormous positions of power and have achieved tremendous things. Look at Madoff. I mean, these are people that are very knowledgeable. They have tremendous skills, but they don't really know themselves. Because somebody that knew their real self could not act that way. They could not deceive others to that extent. So the other possibility is upgrading the current version of yourself, which is what I like to do and what I've dedicated my life to. Not only the current version of a person's self, but the current version of leader's self. Because I figured if you can change a leader, then you're changing thousands of people, not just one. And most of us, again, spend our lives pursuing the first path. So now I'm going to talk a little bit about the brain and what keeps us stuck and what keeps us from being able to change. The number one operating principle of our brain is what? To keep us alive. And the brain will drive your behavior to minimize threat. The core need of the brain is safety, and it constantly scans on a non-conscious level and interferes with higher brain processes. So you're going to see that there's a part of everyone's brain that's actually the reason that we're all here today, because our ancestors had a good amygdala, and that's the name of that part. And we're going to talk a little bit about it, only because I want you to understand what's underneath my words. This isn't just a pep talk. This isn't just a sermon. I'm going to actually tell you what keeps you from being your higher self, what keeps you from being as effective as you can be, and what to do about it to unravel the puzzle of your life. Now, the neurological equipment devoted to threat is 5 times that devoted to anything else. So already we have a predisposition to look for danger, to look for threat. Because our ancestors had that predisposition and it worked well, that's the reason we're here. That's the reason I'm talking to you, because your ancestors and my ancestors, when they saw a stick, they thought it was a snake. And when they didn't see a snake and think it was a stick and go to pick it up. So we're the result of some pretty smart people that acted in a pretty decisive and timely manner and stayed alive and were able to pass on their genes to their ancestors, which is us. And the brain is also 5 times more likely to recall negative experiences than positive experiences. Now none of that is the result of learning, none of that is the result of your history. That's the result of your neurology. That's how we're designed. We're designed to survive. And to survive in the primitive environment, you had to be more focused on, is that a tiger in the bushes, than to be sort of thinking about what a beautiful sunset this is today. All right, so our brain is calibrated to keep us alive, and it's much more focused just neurologically on the negative than the positive. And that's a tendency that we have to learn to overcome. Now, there are 2 hardwired brain tendencies. The first is to interpret ambiguity as danger. And the second is, in the face of threat or in the face of stress, to double down. So when we're faced with ambiguity, we think we're in danger. And when we experience stress, what do? We regress to our primitive way. You know, like you say, I'm not going to blow up at people and scream at them and call them names anymore. But then in the face of stress, all of a sudden it happens. Okay? That's because the brain has hardwired tendencies that cause you to do both of those things. And you know what part of the brain helps you overcome that? The frontal lobes. But we have to learn how to use our frontal lobes to direct our lives and to enlarge our capability. Now, the one thing that happens that's interesting, most animals, including humans, focus on physical dangers. But since we no longer live in an environment where there are poisonous snakes all around us and people are trying to club us and there are saber-toothed tigers in the forest trying to eat us and devour us, what we've done is we've taken all that neurological equipment that was designed to save our life and we've neuroticized it. We've now, we use that equipment now to think, to fear the unknown, to fear failure. So our brain reacts to the fear of failure just like our ancestors reacted to a saber-toothed tiger about to attack them. And then the fear of humiliation and rejection. Again, these are all psychological fears, but all of us design our life to avoid those very things, just as if they were physical dangers. Okay, so I'm going to tell you a story about the amygdala now, and then I'm going to show you where it is in the brain. When I was 16 years old, my parents made the mistake of buying me a brand new Pontiac Grand Prix. And unfortunately, my father drove an old car at the time. And he bought me this brand new car, and I said, "Dad, why are you driving an old car and giving me a brand new car?" And he said, "Well, it's more important to you than it is to me." And so I thought there was some wisdom in that. So one day we were driving back from Miami. I was driving my new car. My parents were in the car. And I was on a divided highway. There was one lane going each way, and there was a median in the middle. And I was going 90 miles an hour. Okay? And all of a sudden, without any awareness whatsoever, I realized that there was a car behind me facing the opposite way as me. So without thinking, without anything, my brain was hijacked by my amygdala. It drove me onto the median at 90 miles an hour. It avoided the signposts that were on the median and the shrubbery that was on the median and took me back to the lane I was on. And only when I looked in the rearview mirror and heard my parents yelling at me did I realize that I did all this without any consciousness at all. That's the part, remember I said the brain's designed for physical survival? It's a little bit like if any of you have had the experience where you've driven somewhere and didn't really recall how you got there and all of a sudden you were there. The brain is a tremendous organism, and we use 0.1% of our brain on a daily basis, and we still succeed. Imagine if we could use 100% of it. So the amygdala hijacks the brain and takes over. All right, now I'm going to talk to you about right and left. I talked about the prefrontal cortex being in front of your brain. Now the right side is pessimism, negative kinds of things. The left side is positive, optimistic, much more thoughtful, much more able to see the future, to anticipate consequences. Now the bad news is the day you're born, the pathway between your amygdala and the right, which is the negative part, is already there at birth. So we start off designed for survival. The pathway to the amygdala and the right prefrontal cortex, which is able to overcome the hijacking of the brain, doesn't really mature to age 25. So if you're talking to someone under 25, don't expect to get too much good thinking done, okay? So that gives you, I'm just giving you this just brief little network because I want you to understand that what I'm really talking to you about today is fundamentally true right down to the biological level of every one of us. And only a small percentage of people know this, and an even smaller percentage of people do something about it. But I'm hoping that this group will be one of the smaller percentage of people. Now, here's the amygdala. It's that little teeny thing that looks like an acorn or a pea. That little thing causes more trouble in our life than almost anything else. That's the hair trigger that takes over the brain and causes, that's what caused me to avoid a head-on collision at 90 miles an hour, that little pea, okay? So you can't underestimate the power of it, but, and I'll show you a way to remember it. Oops, sorry. Okay, now what I want to show you is, remember I told you that the right was pessimistic and the left was optimistic, and the left matures at age 25. I'm going to show you 3 photographs of a man, and the photograph on your left side is going to be two right sides of the face. So it's really reflecting the right hemisphere, the negative part. The one in the middle is like a normal photograph that any of us might take. It's showing the left and the right. And the one on your right is going to show the 2 lefts, which is going to show more feeling. Now, I want you to see that what's going on in our brain shows on our face. Now, think about this. You're negotiating with a customer. You're doing different things. People are reading your face, and it gets even better when we talk about mirror neurons. Here you go. Look at the one all the way on your left and the one all the way on your right. Can you see a difference between those 2 faces? That's what's occurring in the brain, okay? And the one in the middle is a normal photograph. So the more we develop our left prefrontal cortex, our left frontal lobes, the more our face is going to look like this and be welcoming to everyone, including our spouses. So now I'm going to talk to you about one other thing that's equally exciting, mirror neurons. Now, what are mirror neurons? Mirror neurons, and I'll show you where they exist in the brain, but everybody's brain has mirror neurons. Now, what do mirror neurons do? If you and I are negotiating, whatever you're thinking or whatever's going on in your brain, no matter what you're saying, my mirror neurons that reflect your mirror neurons are stimulated in my brain. So when somebody said, you know, this guy's talking a good game, but I don't really trust them, that's mirror neurons, okay? So mirror neurons, they activate in us what the other person is doing, feeling or intending, which means there's an emotional subtext to every conversation, business dealing, personal dealing, family dealing. It's linked to modeling, and I'm going to talk a little bit about that, and you're going to be amazed at some of this stuff. And it operates outside of consciousness, right? Now, I'm just showing you this briefly. This is where the mirror neuron parts of your brain are. The frontal lobes are over here on the right. But you can see those are the area of your brain that are packed with these receptors that are telling you what the emotional experience of the person you're dealing with is. Now, this is the most major it excites me every time I talk about this. This is the brain of an infant that's a newborn, you can see on the left. And there's no activity between the brain cells. And this is a 2-year-old all the way on the right. There's already developing some networks. They're starting, a 2-year-old has more to engage with than a newborn. But that's not the amazing part. This is the amazing part. This is an infant that's 41 minutes old. Okay, talk about hardwired. At 41 minutes of age, the infant can mimic 3 expressions in an adult. At 41 minutes of age, there's nothing in the brain. So we're hardwired to relate to other people, to model other people. So why do our parents have such an influence on us? How can they convince us that we're thick-headed or stubborn or less capable or not good at math? Because this mirror neuron system and modeling is the most powerful learning variable in the world. That's why they say, it's not telling your kids what they should do or not do. They're going to do what you do. And so if you want to influence your workforce, if you want to have an influence on others, then you need to be what you want those other persons to be to you. Now, this is Richard Boyatis. Remember, I told you he danced through the... Now, he did the most amazing study of leadership. And Richard, after he danced through the audience, he filled us with 2 hours of brilliance. And then he had the coat and tie on. He laid on the floor on his back, and he said, "Any questions?" So he was really a cool guy. And he had an engineering degree from MIT and a PhD in psychology from Harvard. But he was like just the most fun human guy you could ever meet. So Richard has done fMRI studies. This is studying blood flow in the brain. And what he has shown is that resonant leaders of good character like we discussed, stimulate mirror neurons in their workers or in their followers. Dissonant leaders, the difficult type of boss, the narcissist, the person that's always right, they shut down mirror neurons in their followers. So the person that's screaming at their employees to do better, to move faster, or whatever, is actually shutting down the very system that they're trying to stimulate. So you don't reach people. The only way you reach people is with forgiveness and compassion and integrity and responsibility. So wherever you're taking a picture, you're taking a photograph of yourself. Okay, I'm going to skip that one. All right, that's essentially not as good a picture. I'm going to steal Michelle's photograph of the iceberg because what they drew for me isn't quite as good. But anyway, you can see behavior is the world most of us live in, above that water line. And at the next level are habits. Now, habits are patterns of behavior. These are things that we may be aware of in ourselves or we may not be aware of. But certainly our significant other can tell us what our habits are. And then at the deepest level, at the underlying level, are assumptions and mental models that are almost always unconscious. Now, I think it's important to remember I talked about the 5th discipline and the definition of a learning organization as the book I thought was the best book I ever read. They define learning as changing your mental models. Learning that occurs in the classroom is changing your behavior. If you're lucky, you might change some habits in your life, but changing your mental models is the kind of learning that occurs in psychotherapy. It's the kind of learning that occurs in executive coaching. It's the kind of learning that's profound learning. Now here's a business book written by a non-psychologist, an MIT business professor, and he defines learning as changing your mental models. That's profound. Now here's the example. If you don't believe that early mental models have an influence on later behavior, these are 3 apex predators that were raised together as infants. They would each kill each other and devour each other in the natural environment. But actually when they took the I forget which one it was. I think it was the Linus, had to go to the vet for a period of time. The other two were just moaning and beside themselves till they brought the Linus back. So this tells you if you can override this, then your mental models are ruling your behavior in a way that you can't even fathom, and you have the capacity to change them. So I want to talk about three things, and this has been important to me for a long time. And how many people here have heard the word emotional intelligence? Okay, that's like a big thing. But I want to distinguish between, remember we talked about behavior, habits, and the unconscious? Well, this is analogous to that. Self-awareness, what is self-awareness? Self-awareness is, let's say, I know I have a bad temper, but I'm stuck with it. Or I know I procrastinate a lot. Or I know that I don't really do my best. You know, you just sort of, you can describe, it's better than non-self-awareness, which not to know you're a jerk. So to know you're a jerk and not do anything about it is self-awareness. To know you're a jerk and develop some skills in order to minimize the impact of your being a jerk on others is emotional intelligence. But the next step is the important one to me, and that's self-knowledge. Self-knowledge is knowing yourself as you truly are. Now, what does that mean? Michelle talked about humility. That definition of self-knowledge comes from a medieval monk, and it was his definition of humility. Humility and self-knowledge are the same thing. You can't know yourself as you truly are and be a thief and be a liar and be cruel, because we weren't designed to be that way. We're only that way to the extent to which we don't know ourselves. And so if your behaviors make you weary, if you're unhappy with some things about yourself, then you don't need to become less yourself. You're already less than yourself. You need to become more of yourself. Now, these are some slides that I put together using the theme of the elephant to make clear the point about leadership and the influence on others. So this is the same elephant I showed you before, tethered by a little stake and a little rope. This is the elephant in a leadership position. What are the other elephants doing? Ignoring them, right? This is called unaware of self. This is self-awareness. The leader is a little bit closer. He sees himself as he is. He creates a little bit more movement on the direct reports. But nothing compared to what could be accomplished is being accomplished. Next step is emotional intelligence. At least he's now sensitive to his impact on others, and they're responding to him by facing him and engaging with him. And then the last one is self-knowledge. And self-knowledge, again, that big audacious goal, dreams that only your heart can hold. And this is what happens to followers when the leader operates at that level. Now, this is I wasn't sure whether I was going to present this today, but I think it's useful to present because sometimes we make the mistake. In my first, after I'd been at the university for a while, the university, really kind of odd, I was a director, and they made me chairman of the search committee to hire a vice president, which is like, you always have vice presidents chairing the search committee, not directors, which is lower than a vice president. But they made me chairman of the search committee, so I actually hired my boss at that time in my career. And so when he came in, I worked for him for about 3 months. And he said, I want you to be associate director and be responsible, have division-wide responsibilities for 500 people. I said, well, I have to give up the counseling center. He said, yeah. I said, I'm not interested. So he said, okay, keep the counseling center. So then the next question he asked me is, how often do you think we need to meet? And I don't know if I'd say that today, but I said it then. I said once every 5 years. And so what I was really telling him was that I was really on the right side of this curve. And what happens is you can see that optimal performance comes at intermediate levels of drive. So that if you're overdriven, you're like driving everything into the ground, your performance actually deteriorates. But if you don't have enough arousal or enough drive, your performance isn't optimal either. So people on the left side of this need encouragement, they need energy, they need a little push maybe, or at least something to liberate their energy. People on the right side are better left alone. That if you micromanage a person on the right side, you can actually increase their arousal to the point of an illness. So you have to know who you're dealing with. And of course, all of the differences that we present to each other are the results of those early experiences with our family, those early mental models. So just because you're high arousal at one point doesn't mean you're going to be at another point in your life. It depends what you subject yourself to. So I'm going to sort of just give you a few principles, and then if there are any questions, I'd be happy to entertain them. The first one I love: nothing living will obey. Even bacteria become penicillin resistant. The second one is we contribute to what we see. We don't see the world as it is. We see what our mental models allow us to see. So nobody is seeing reality as reality, and we all see there's enough overlap between us that we can communicate and respond as if we're seeing the same thing, but we're really not. We are seeing what our history allows us to see. And there's a line in my first book called Business Success Through Self-Knowledge, and it goes like this: we contribute to what we see and then use what we observe to validate what we already believe. So we live in this self-fulfilling circle that never enlarges our consciousness, never creates a bigger world for us to live in, never gives us more life, but adds a lot of predictability, and the brain likes it because the brain is 5 times more likely to focus on loss than on potential. Next one, I love this one. Commitment to a relationship is a function of the possibility of growth. That also is true of commitment to a company. If you're in a relationship and there's no potential for growth, what happens? You get bored, you stray, you're not going to stick. If you're in a company where there's no pathway for you to grow, to expand, even if you're a leader and there's no pathway to expand, you lose your energy. You give up the most significant parts of yourself. Here's another one I love. People only invest in what they themselves create. So you as a leader, you have to find a way to allow the people that are working for you to be conscious of the fact that they are investing in themselves. Let them remember the idea of a shared vision. It sort of bubbles up from all of us. If they participate in what the company is accomplishing, if they have a say in how you're going to approach customers, or whatever the variable is, it makes a big difference in their commitment. And I'll tell you, I told you I have one of the Navy SEALs on my team, Navy SEAL Commander Peter Berardi. He told me something about Navy SEAL training that I thought was really interesting. In Navy SEAL training, unlike other parts of the military, you can pretty well ignore rank. So that a Navy SEAL that's new on the force could walk into a general's office without, could make an appointment with the general. In the regular military, you don't cross rank like that. You go to your commanding officer and then sort of like a hierarchy up the chain of command. So one of the things that they found, and this was years ago, is that a lot of SEALs were dying doing the missions, and they were dying because they were overthinking the mission. One of the ways one of the things that makes the Navy SEALs so successful is they use overwhelming force. Like if you need 5 people to invade this house, they send 30. So it's overwhelming force. So, but what they found is they decided that everybody had to have a voice before the mission went on, and that once the decision was made, they all had to. Once there was a consensus, they had to buy in, but they were allowed to express their opinion. So you have a general or admiral in the Navy SEALs, and you have Navy SEAL captains and commanders and new Navy SEALs. They're all part of this team that's going to go on a mission. Well, what do they do? Everybody in that team gets to offer their 2 cents about the mission. Like if you're the lowest ranking person in the room and you say to the general, I think we need more oxygen for this mission because I've been in those waters and there's a lot of currents and we're not going to get there as quickly, and my fear is we're going to run out of oxygen. They listen to you. They may not change your tanks, but everyone gets a chance to say what they think and have their input. Then a decision is made for the whole group right before the mission is executed. That cut down death rates by 80% on all missions. Just being able to voice your opinion. So if you have people working for you, just listen to them. Even if it doesn't go their way, if they get the respect and at least their opinion gets listened to in a serious way before expressing your own, you've bought a loyal employee or a person on the way to being a loyal employee. Okay, and then the 5th one is just the curve I showed you, the Yerkes-Dodson curve, that optimal performance occurs at intermediate levels of drive. Not too high, not too low. All right, here's a few more, what I call these cross-validated truths. I think these are true of every human being, and I hope that you will agree. Number 1, the quality of the relationship you have with yourself, remember your mental model, is the highest upper limit on the quality of a relationship you can have with any other human being. So if you hate yourself, if you're criticizing yourself, if you're depressed, if you feel hopeless, if you feel like you can't get anywhere, that's it for your relationships with other human beings. The things that we're aware of in ourselves are less influential than the things we don't know. We've already made that point. What we don't know about ourselves, oh, I like this one. What we don't know about ourselves glints and winks at us throughout our lives, and we actively avoid answering the call. What that means is that's the part of you that says, you know, maybe I could do more than I think I could. Maybe I shouldn't define myself as I am now. Maybe there's more to me than even I realize. Even though I've been placing a lot of power in my own thoughts, my thoughts could really give me a false picture of myself. And just doubting yourself, just opening the possibility that you don't really know as much about yourself as you think to, is the beginning of enlarging your access to yourself and your real capacity. And there's a direct relationship between your level of self-knowledge, your impact on others, and how comfortable others feel in your presence. All right, then the rest I was just going to show you. These are a couple of the books I've written. They may or may not be of interest to you. The first one was Business Success Through Self-Knowledge. The second is Ascend, Forging a Path to Your Truer Self. That's sort of a book that's a general book for everyone. The first one's more focused on business. The second one's a lot easier to read. It's about people that live on a mountain, and as you ascend the mountain, you grow in your level of self-knowledge and effectiveness. And it's pretty interesting. It's an allegory. And then this is a book called The Path, which Navy SEAL Commander Peter Berardi wrote to accompany my second book, Ascend. So that's pretty much my presentation. I'm open for questions of any kind whatsoever. Thank you. Any questions? Any questions? I love any questions. Yes, sir.
Yeah, I just, when you were talking about the animals, the apex predators over socialized, you know, obviously there's a crucial point to rewire the brain. Right. Is it ever like, you know,
Oh, of course. Yeah, you know, there's a, have you ever seen there was a German naturalist called Konrad Lorenz. And what Konrad Lorenz did is he came up with the concept of imprinting, which is the critical period. And he took some geese eggs and he took the mother away from the eggs, and he was present when the geese hatched. And so the only person the geese ever had identified as the parent was him. And so those geese would follow him just like they would their mother everywhere he went. They'd be in a string behind him. And I'll tell you what else is amazing. as adults, they wouldn't mate with other geese because it wasn't imprinted in their brain that was their species. So, however, if the 2-week period passed, like weeks 3, 4, and 5, let's say they'd been with their mother 2 weeks, and then he tried that trick, it didn't work. And so, yeah, I agree. That's a very, very good point.
Core beliefs about what I'm capable of, I mean, we talk about rewiring like our own brains. Like, is it just too late for us?
I don't think so. I think you have neuroplasticity your whole life. There's a book, you may want to get it. It's by Daniel Goleman, the emotional intelligence guy. It's called Altered Traits. See, what happens is, I'll talk to you about a primate study because this is kind of interesting. They took a primate, this was at a primate lab, and they sutured 2 of the primate's fingers together on both hands. Now, when the fingers are separate, you have 5 different parts of your brain. When you touch each finger, 5 separate parts of your brain light up. Then they sutured the 2 fingers together, and over 3 months, those 5 areas of the brain reduced to 4. Then they left them for they took them apart for another 3 months, and then those 5 areas returned to 5. So if the brain changes from just tying your fingers together for 3 months, the human brain is different than animal brains. We have a lot of plasticity. You can completely revamp your brain. It takes a lot of work. I always tell people that people want the resurrection without the crucifixion. And there's going to be a crucifixion if you really change yourself. And the longer you avoid it, the longer you postpone payday. But you never avoid payday.
It has to be a will first.
Well, yeah.
I mean, if you don't want to change, you're not going to.
Yeah, you have to have enough healthy tissue to want to strive to be better. Any other questions? Yes, sir.
A trend that's happening, Michelle even mentioned it in her talk, was manifesting your own destiny and manifesting things in your life. Absolutely. Could you just touch on that?
Yeah, I think what Michelle's talking about is the same thing as we talked about when you said you need to have a goal that's so big that only your heart can hold it. You can't even define it. You see, the problem is people want to define something before they pursue it. But I can tell you, you can't define something that's greater than you think you are now. So you have to go into the unknown. You have to trust something in yourself that you can't fully define and keep moving forward. And there are a lot of metaphors. Like in the New Testament, there are a couple of metaphors that say, you must become as a little child to enter the kingdom of God. To me, if you view that as a metaphor, whether you're religious or not, doesn't matter. That means you have to go back and revamp that early mental model to become a grown-up, okay? The St. Augustine, there's a quote in one of my books, St. Augustine says, to know yourself is to know God. And what that means to me is if you truly know yourself, you have power, more power than you ever imagined you could have, but it can only be used for good. So even if you just want to view those as metaphors and not religious teachings, they say a lot about what Michelle was talking about. Okay? All right, thank you very much. I appreciate it. Okay. Thank you.